It was October 29th, 1984. A dark and drizzly night, not unlike the one we experienced last night. And the doorbell rang at the home of Lee and Levon Couch, who lived in a quiet neighborhood in southwestern Chicago. It was the worst possible reason a doorbell could ring. At the door was a man in a suit coat and slacks and tie. He was a police detective. Their 14-year-old son, Stephen, had been struck by a car and was in intensive care in the hospital. Hoping that this news was a little overdramatic, Levon and Lee took their 10-year-old daughter to a neighbor and went to the hospital. And when Levon saw Stephen, her knees buckled. She couldn't even recognize him because his head was so swollen. The sight of him just sent shocks of fear and pain throughout her whole body. That was just the beginning of the pain. First thing they did was call their pastor, Pastor Jeff, who was a new guy just out of seminary, new to their church. Got him out of his easy chair where he was watching Monday Night Football. He was at the hospital first thing, and then family and friends started finding out and coming. And Lee and Levon and the pastor could go in to see Stephen about 5 to 10 minutes every hour. The rest of the time, they were all together in the waiting room with these family and friends, holding one another, crying, praying. For 5 long days and nights, this went on. But Stephen started to get better. The swelling on his head started to recede. He was coming toward consciousness. He could even squeeze Levon's hand when she'd call his name, even though he couldn't yet open his eyes. It felt good enough to go home and have a good night's sleep at home that 5th night. Early Sunday morning, the 6th day, they got a phone call. The worst kind of phone call parents can get. Stephen's condition had seriously deteriorated, and by the time they got to the hospital, he was already brain dead. So they went in and just sat with him. The very nice woman in a white coat gently sat down with them in a little while and asked them if it would be okay with them if they would take him off life support so they could harvest his organs for others. It was so awful, so macabre, yet so right. So they said yes. Then they left the hospital for the last time. And their beautiful, precious 14-year-old son was dead. Suddenly dead. And then the real pain started to set. Telling their 10-year-old daughter, picking out a casket and a burial plot, figuring out what clothes of his were going to be the last clothes he would wear, figuring out the funeral arrangements. There were so many details. They pleaded with the funeral director to let not only the service but the wake be held at their church, because they said, we don't want anything of this experience to be reminding us of death. We want to be somewhere where we're reminded of life. That's the church. So they had his wake in the baptismal chapel, which was right next to the sanctuary. And in this baptismal chapel, besides the font, there was this large hanging sculpture of Jesus on the cross. And that Jesus wasn't bent over in agonizing pain and suffering, but was standing on this cross, was standing proudly, with his eyes open and looking out as if to tell everyone who was in there, I have triumphed over death. This was so helpful for Levon to be looking at this and giving her the courage to take the next steps forward. The day of the wake, she made it as far as the pastor's office. If people came and wanted to see her, they would need to go in to the office and see her there. Her husband was out with all the people. And after the service, after the burial, the really real pain started to Levon's husband had a job and went back to work. Their daughter was a school child, went back to school. Levon didn't have a job. She went back to bed, sometimes 18 hours a day, to cry, to pray, mostly to cry. She says, I was a zombie. My head and my heart and my mind were essentially dead. The only way I knew I had a heart and soul was that I was in pain. Pain was my constant companion. I prayed and I prayed and I prayed for peace, and still it didn't come. Sometimes I would get a whiff of Stephen's scent in my house. I knew it was his scent, and it was like it drew me into his presence as if he was there. I couldn't bear to wash his sheets for weeks, or wash the laundry that was still in his hamper. It was the last vestiges of his presence. I would lay on those sheets, and I would smell them, and I would just bathe them, shower them with my tears. Sometimes I'd have the energy to get up and make dinner and set the table, and I would inadvertently set it for 4, and my daughter would say, are we having a guest, Mom? Damn it. I shook my fist at God, and I said, where were you that night, God? Why did you take care of him? You're almighty. You're all God. What did Stephen ever do to you? Didn't you hear our prayers and our pleas? I never gave up on the Word of God. And yet, so much of the Bible didn't really hit me. What did help was going to Pastor Jeff's office, and often, and I would just sit there and talk and cry and get everything out, and he would sit and listen and not judge or offer a lot of canned advice. Mostly I just got to hear myself talk and start sorting through layer upon layer of emotion and turmoil. I knew I needed to go to church, but I didn't want to be the center of attention. And I couldn't bear the anguished look in the eyes of the congregation, my church family, who I felt so needed a word of encouragement from me, and I just didn't have the energy to give it. Pastor Jeff and I decided it would be best if I went late and left early, which I did. I cried through most of the service, but I went. The first anniversary of his death, I knew would be really hard. I'd read about the fact that you're going to be reliving all sorts of nightmarish memories, and I was getting prepared for that, knowing I would have 7 days of endless, agonizing memories. And yes, they were all there. It was a whole week of, a year ago, I got the doorbell rang. A year ago, we went to the hospital. A year ago this. A year ago that. And on that very anniversary of his actual death date, we were at the cemetery with flowers, holding each other, crying, my husband and me. And suddenly, I felt this huge wave of relief. We had been so anxiety-prone. We'd been filled with so much anxiousness about getting through this week, and we'd done it. This profound sense of calm came over me. A little later, I read that the Baptist church down the street was having a support group. They were reading a book about understanding mourning, so I decided, I was afraid to go, but I somehow summoned up the courage, and I went to this group. I didn't know anybody. There were all sorts of people experiencing all sorts of grief. And as we read through this book, and after about 6 weeks, I finally kind of opened up and was able to listen and able to talk a little bit. And I came to realize that people are grieving for all sorts of reasons. And all sorts of people are grieving. People of faith have to grieve. They don't get a blank slate for that. Jesus grieved, no matter who you are. God doesn't keep all those strong emotions that cut you to the quick when somebody you love dies. What I did discover was that as a Christian, I did have hope. I did have this resurrection promise that death and grief don't have the last word, Even though I couldn't emotionally hold on to it, intellectually, I had that idea. And it began to make me think, maybe I could survive this. Maybe someday, my husband and I could be the capable parents we once were, and maybe we could have some semblance of happiness as a 3-member family. When year 2 of his anniversary, the second anniversary of death came around, I had 2 simple goals. 1, I wasn't going to cry every day. And 2, I was going to start looking for the goodness around me. It wasn't easy, and I sometimes wasn't very good at it. One of the things that really helped was that my husband and I decided that we could, and it was time to start really celebrating Stephen's life as opposed to mourning his death. And we set up a scholarship in his honor at the high school. And when the church had started a daycare center, we bought the play equipment in his honor. And we decided every year we would put a living Christmas tree in that baptismal chapel where that cross was, where his casket had been. It seemed, we hoped, to be an opportunity to open other people to being able to talk with us now about what had happened. And still people were so reticent. There was still this elephant in the middle of the room, mostly because people were trying to protect me, because they were afraid talking about it would continue to hurt me. Right after the 3rd anniversary of his death, someone at a PTA meeting introduced me as, this is the woman whose son was struck and killed by a motorist at 99th and Kedzie. I couldn't believe the gall of this woman to introduce me in that way. What insolence, what insensitivity. And yet I remember that Pastor Jeff a long time ago had said, remember, Levon, you are more than just the mother of a son who was killed in a car accident. And yet, here I was being identified as that. Was that really the only way that people knew me? I was so angry at her and myself and the situation that the next day, I didn't cry all day. I couldn't believe it. Then I started feeling guilty that I wasn't crying, that I should be sadder. Then I got over that. And then a few days went by and I wasn't crying. Not that that would happen all the time, but I started to not have these crying jags every day. One day I discovered I could belly laugh. Tears rolling down my face. I was actually rolling on the floor. I couldn't believe that I could still laugh, that mechanism was still in me. That was great. And then I walked outside one morning and the beautiful yellow rays of the sun, and the bluest sky I'd ever seen, and the grass of emerald green. For 3+ years, all I'd been able to see was gray. And now, life, color had returned. All I could do was say a loud thank you to God. And my husband and I found a way to start really talking about the ways that we each had grieved his loss. And they were very different. And there were so many times during those years that I was angry that my husband was reacting in a certain way that wasn't the way I was grieving. And yet something in me told me not to be critical of the way he was grieving, and something in him told him not to be critical of the way I was grieving, but instead to just share words of encouragement, sit with one another in silence. So many couples divorce when they lose a child. And for some reason, we were able to hang on to those vows. We were able to stick it out. We were able to know that we had made through this most nightmarish of situations together. Nothing could tear us apart. And on the 5th anniversary of his death, it was also the 20th anniversary of our wedding, we had a renewal of vows that was so meaningful and so full of love. Because we had gone through hell and back, and were more in love with one another than we ever had before. I was then invited to go to a support group and give a talk to over 100 people about my grief experience. And of course, I knew that I couldn't do it. So I called the people to tell them I couldn't do it, and found myself saying, yes, I'll do it. I was wondering where those words came from. And then I knew that that was God speaking through me. Because I suddenly realized that I needed to do that. I needed to share my story, the good, the bad, the ugly, because I had been through what those people out there were going through, and I could tell them about what to expect and what to hope for and what to think about in a way that nobody else could, because I had been there. I started to realize that this was my calling, my vocation, and everything in my life had actually guided me to this place, to being a healer, a spokesperson for those undergoing horrible, nightmarish grief. In October of 2004, I found myself waking up one morning with this overwhelming sense of joy. It was very strange, and it wasn't just a moment of ebullience, but it was lasting for 10 days. Just this incredible, joyful feeling. And I started to worry, sort of like when somebody hugs you a little too long. I started to get a little concerned, like when you know there's a meeting you should be going to, and you maybe have forgotten it. And I called my Pastor Jeff. I wasn't living there anymore, and he was somewhere else. And we talked a little bit, and I suddenly realized that I had made it over to the other side of grief. It's 20 years, but now I was living on the other side of grief, and I was living in a state of gratitude. Grateful for this whole journey that I had gone through, the unsurpassed, innumerable blessings that I and my family had experienced, where it had brought us. Not that God had caused all these horrible things to happen, or that I would wish it on anyone. But stuff happens. And I'm here to tell you that God is with us and seeks to fill us with love and be with us as we take this journey from grief to gratitude. We have nothing to fear. And I got it in me to write a book called The Other Side of Grief, a personal faith journey from grief to gratitude. It's a great book. I really highly recommend it. Very readable. And I think it's a great story for us to hear as we prepare for Thanksgiving. A day when there is so much that we are encouraged to be thankful for. The things that are all around us, that they fill us with immediate gratitude, the wonderful feast that hopefully we get to enjoy in some way. Friends and family that are wonderful. We're thankful for our home. As Jenny named a number of wonderful things. We're thankful for our home, for our job, which, is, if not good, it's good enough. And our health, which if not good, is good enough. And the weather, which, is always fabulous here, even though we do complain about it. We have a chance to just be grateful for our Southern California weather. We have a chance to be grateful that we live in a country where we're free to watch Fox News. We're also free to turn it off whenever we want. We're free to watch whatever we want. And we are free to watch football, or a Twilight Zone marathon. If that's not on, we get to watch it on YouTube. There's just so many things we can be endlessly grateful for. And yet, if we are going to really embrace the true spirit of Thanksgiving, the thing that we can also, maybe most importantly, open ourselves up for gratitude is for the experiences of grief that we've had in our lives. The things that have broken our hearts and crushed our souls, that perhaps we thought we would never make it through. To be grateful for a God that indeed journeys with us, as God did with those pilgrims long ago, bringing surprising angels from the least likely quarters, the least likely experiences, to bring the healing that is needed, to give us patience, to hold us when we're a mess, and to bring us to this place where we can actually be grateful. Grateful for this difficult journey and the resurrection that lives on the other side, that makes us stronger, more compassionate, more purposeful, more in love with God and in love with life than we ever were before. If we haven't gone through that journey, we can know that perhaps it will be upon us someday and we have indeed nothing to fear. We can be with those who are going through those journeys and be that loving presence, be that living hope. And we can especially be grateful when Thanksgiving comes around for this God that indeed is always with us, a faith that we're encouraged to have, not only a reaching out to a God that's always with us, but a story that we can hang on to, and a community of people that we can be with, and that can be with us when we're going through really tough times. It may be the church congregation that we presently have, or a church congregation that we stumbled into that gives us the answers that we need at this time, or the church congregation that we had a long time ago, or whatever it might be. Give God thanks for the community of faith that keeps us connected and keeps us moving on when all we want to do and all we think we're capable of doing is dying ourselves.